Welcome to the deep dive. I want to start today with a little thought experiment that might surprise you.
Okay.
Imagine you've got a group of kids, right? Complete strangers. You put them into two groups based on something totally arbitrary. I don't know, maybe one group likes apples, the other likes bananas. Or maybe they just prefer a painting by artist A over artist B.
Right, something really trivial.
Exactly. What's truly astonishing is that even without any direct competition, without them knowing anything personal about their own group members or, those in the other group, they will often almost immediately start favoring their own group.
Just like that.
Just like that, this profound us versus them distinction just appears almost out of thin air. Now, for anyone listening who's stepping into an elementary classroom, that's not just some curious fact, is it? It feels like a foundational insight into, human social interaction itself.
It really is. And what's truly fascinating there, beyond just the speed, the sheer speed with which these distinctions form, is the immediate and, frankly, powerful ripple effect they have on perception, on behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It really underscores that group identity isn't just some, casual label we pick up. It's a deeply ingrained, almost automatic lens. It's how we start perceiving ourselves, how we categorize others, and ultimately how we navigate the whole social world. It's fundamental, a building block of our reality.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. Today, we're embarking on a really deep dive into this powerful and often pretty surprising concept of group identity within psychology.
That was good.
We'll be drawing heavily from what's known as the social identity perspective. It's a sort of foundational framework. You find it outlined in authoritative texts like the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research.
Right, the key texts in the field.
Our mission today is to explore how our very sense of self, who we think we are, is, inextricably tied to the groups we belong to, and what that means for how we interact with the world, and crucially, how we interact with each other. And for you, our listener, especially if you're, say, an elementary education major, understanding this isn't just academic theory, it feels foundational. It's gold. Really.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is. What's profoundly valuable here is how these theories don't just meticulously describe human behavior. They also offer incredibly powerful, predictive insights into why groups, anything from a small classroom cohort right up to an entire nation, operate and interact the way they do.
Right.
So we're going to try and connect these intricate psychological concepts directly to that vibrant, sometimes unpredictable, always dynamic environment of elementary education. This knowledge isn't just theoretical fluff, it's a highly practical tool.
How so?
Well, man, imagine being able to make real sense of those subtle and sometimes not so subtle dynamics you see on the playground every day. Think about understanding why classroom cliques form, or why certain teamwork challenges just keep cropping up, or even how a single class just sort of spontaneously develops its own unique culture, its own personality as a group.
Yeah, you see that happen all the time.
Exactly. And this understanding gives you the power, potentially, to anticipate conflicts before they really escalate, to interpret student behaviors that might otherwise seem, baffling, and, most importantly, to intentionally foster a more positive, more inclusive, and ultimately more effective learning environment for every single child. That's the practical power this kind of deep dive offers you as an educator.
Okay, fantastic. So let's start by laying some essential groundwork then. The main framework for understanding group identity and social psychology today is generally known as the social identity approach.
That's the umbrella term, yeah.
And it's not just one single theory, is it? It's more like a big perspective that includes two main interconnected theories. Social identity theory people usually call it SIT, and it's sort of expanded relative self-categorization theory, or SCT.
That's right, SIT and SCT. Together, they give us this really holistic lens to view social behavior.
And this whole approach, it didn't just appear out of nowhere, did it? It has some pretty deep roots.
Oh, absolutely. It's profoundly rooted in some incredibly powerful and deeply personal human experiences. The main architect of this whole theoretical framework was a Polish Jewish social psychologist named Henri Tajfel.
Tajfel, right.
He survived the unimaginable horrors of World War II. He was a prisoner of war, and he navigated those brutal years by meticulously keeping his Jewish identity a secret.
Wow.
His lived experiences, particularly that visceral understanding of how one's group identity could be, not just a source of belonging and strength for your in-group, but also a target for intense prejudice, devaluation, and just existential threat from out-groups. That profoundly shaped his entire life's work.
You can see how it would.
Yeah. this deeply personal history, this kind of raw understanding of identity's double-edged sword, it really fuels the entire framework we're discussing. Even before he developed SIT proper, his early foundational work focused on the very basic human cognitive process of categorization.
Putting things into boxes, essentially.
Exactly. And what he called accentuation theory. He showed that when we classify stimuli, even something really simple, like lines of different lengths or coins of different values, our perception gets subtly warped. We tend to perceive the differences between the categories as larger, more pronounced than they actually are.
Mm.
And at the same time, we perceive the differences within a single category as smaller, more homogeneous. Things within the box seem more alike.
Interesting.
This phenomenon laid the crucial cognitive groundwork for understanding how we categorize people. So for an elementary education major, think about a child subtly categorizing their classmates into, say, the kids who are good at math and the kids who are good at art. Teichfeld's early work suggests that just doing that, just making that mental categorization, can lead those children to exaggerate the differences between those two groups, while maybe minimizing the unique talents of differences amongst the individual kids within the math group or the art group.
It's like a fundamental cognitive bias that just sets the stage for group formation, even before any interaction happens.
Precisely. It makes the world seem simpler, more clear-cut, perhaps.
That makes so much intuitive sense. It's almost like the very act of mentally putting things into distinct bins makes those bins appear inherently more different from each other and more uniform inside. So, okay, if we apply that powerful idea of categorization to people, what exactly is this thing called social identity within this framework? How did Tajfeld define it?
Well, Teichfeld defines social identity quite carefully. He described it as that integral part of an individual's self-concept, how you see yourself, that directly corresponds to your knowledge that you belong to a particular social group or groups.
Okay, so knowing you're a member.
But, and this is crucial, it's far more than just knowing you're part of a group. It also encompasses the profound value and the deep emotional significance that an individual attaches to that membership.
Okay. Value and emotion.
Yes. So it's not merely a label you wear like a sticker. It's a feeling, it's a meaning, and it's a fundamental aspect of who you perceive yourself to be in relation to other people. It's an internalized sense of we-ness.
Right. So it's not just about saying, okay, I'm part of the red team in a purely sort of intellectual way.
Exactly.
It's also about feeling something about being on the red team, maybe pride or belonging or even some kind of responsibility. And then maybe it involves comparing your red team to, say, the blue team, and perhaps wanting the red team to come out looking better somehow.
Precisely. And this naturally brings up a really important question that the theory tackles head on. What's the fundamental purpose or motivation behind this constant process? This categorizing, identifying, comparing, why do we do it?
Yeah, what's the driver?
Social identity theory proposes that we humans are profoundly motivated to achieve, and then to carefully maintain, something called positive group distinctiveness.
Positive group distinctiveness. Okay.
This means we have this inherent drive for our group, not only to be seen as good or worthy, but also to be uniquely different and ideally demonstrably better than other groups in some way that matters, some valued way.
So it's about feeling good about our group, but also feeling like our group stands out.
Yes. It's about finding a deep sense of value, meaning, and a positive identity through our group memberships. We don't just want to be a group. We often want to be the group, or at least a highly valued and distinct one. It's about differentiation.
I see. And the sense of group identity, it's not always equally important all the time, is it? I remember the source material talking about an interpersonal intergroup continuum that suggests its importance can shift quite a bit.
That's a critical point to grasp, absolutely. Group identity isn't some fixed, always-on switch in our heads. It's prominence, its importance, what psychologists call its salience. It fluctuates depending on the context.
Okay.
Becomes far more salient, far more influential in what are termed intergroup contexts, basically. Situations where two or more groups are interacting or being compared.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about the classic example of being a fan at a football match. In that specific moment, your identity as a fan of Team A becomes highly salient. It's a relatively mundane but still potent intergroup context.
Right. Your Team A versus Team B fans.
Exactly. Now, compare that to something far more consequential, like being involved in a war between nations. In that situation, your national identity becomes absolutely paramount. It's a highly impactful, deeply felt intergroup context.
Okay. Makes sense. So how does this play out in a classroom?
Well, for you,
Yeah.
as an elementary education major, understanding this continuum is incredibly relevant day to day. A student might just be a kid, an individual. When they're playing alone during free time, their personal identity is probably foremost.
Uh-huh.
But the moment they're asked to participate in, say, a school-wide assembly where their class is interacting with other grades, they instantly become a member of the third grade class. That group identity comes right to the front.
Right. They're representing their grade.
Or during literacy time, maybe they're divided into reading groups. Suddenly, they might transform into a reader in the green group and start defining themselves in relation to the blue group or the yellow group. The specific social context directly shifts which identity becomes most active, most important, and most influential on how they act.
So recognizing those shifts can help a teacher understand why a kid might act differently in different situations.
Exactly. Why they might show different levels of cooperation or express different loyalties, depending on whether they're in their reading group with their whole class or just playing with a friend. It's fluid.
Okay, so it's not a static label we carry around. It's profoundly dynamic, context-dependent, and that fluidity leads us right into the core findings of social identity theory, that rapid formation of us versus them. And maybe the most surprising finding that really set this theory apart was what Tajfal called the minimal group phenomenon.
Ah, yes, the minimal group studies. They are truly groundbreaking, almost counterintuitive when you first hear about them, and they absolutely revolutionized how we understand intergroup relations.
What was so minimal about them?
Well, Tajfel and his colleagues designed these pioneering studies precisely to uncover the absolute bare minimum conditions required for group favoritism and discrimination to actually emerge. In these experiments, participants, often schoolboys in the early studies, were categorized based on incredibly trivial, almost completely meaningless criteria.
Like the paintings example.
Exactly. Like they might be told they simply preferred abstract paintings by the artist Klee over Kandinsky or vice versa. Or sometimes it was even based on estimates of dots on a screen, something completely arbitrary.
Okay.
The genius of these experiments and what made the findings so profound was what happened next. These boys then allocated resources, usually points, sometimes small monetary rewards to other anonymous individuals, and crucially, they allocated these resources to people identified only as members of their own newly formed in-group, or the anonymous out-group.
So they didn't know who they were giving points to.
No personal knowledge at all. And importantly, the boys themselves could not personally benefit from how they allocated these rewards. It was a completely anonymous and, on the surface, selfless act of distribution between these two unknown groups.
Here's where it gets really interesting, right? Because the results kind of blew existing ideas out of the water.
They really did. What they found was astonishing. Mere categorization, this incredibly thin, arbitrary grouping based on practically nothing, was sufficient to encourage in-group favoritism.
Just being told you're in the Klee group.
Yes. Participants consistently gave more resources to those anonymous individuals identified as being in their own group, even though that grouping was entirely meaningless and arbitrary. But it gets even more surprising.
How so?
They often didn't just give more to their in-group. They actively worked to maximize the difference in rewards favoring their in-group, even if it meant giving their own group less in absolute terms than they could have.
Wait, say that again. They'd give their own group less just to make sure the other group got even less?
Precisely. They call this the maximum difference strategy. It was a powerful demonstration. The differentiation itself, creating that gap between us and them, not just absolute gain for us, was a key motivator.
Wow, that's subtle but powerful.
It was revolutionary because it directly challenged the dominant theories of intergroup conflict at the time, particularly Muzaffar Sharif's realistic group conflict theory, which basically proposed that discrimination and conflict only arose from actual concrete conflicts over scarce resources or competing goals, like two teams competing for one prize.
Right, like a real competition was needed.
Yes. But in Tajfel's minimal group studies, there were no clear conflicts of interest, no competition for a tangible prize, no personal gain for the allocator. The basis of the discrimination seemed entirely symbolic or purely social. It starkly highlighted that simply perceiving oneself as part of a group, no matter how trivial its basis, could lead to powerful, almost automatic favoritism towards that group. It wasn't necessarily about hating the other group. It was about valuing and enhancing your own, even based on nothing substantial.
So bringing this back to our elementary education major again. Imagine you're just, I don't know, telling a group of elementary students, okay, you guys are the lions, and you lot over there are the tigers. Maybe just for a morning meeting activity. According to these foundational studies, even without setting up a specific game or offering a prize or having any real competition, those children might just instinctively start favoring their own team members, simply because they're now lions or tigers. It's not malicious, necessarily.
Not at all. It's more like a deep-seated psychological tendency. And this has profound, often overlooked, classroom relevance for every single educator. Even those seemingly innocent or just practical groupings a teacher creates.
Like table groups.
Exactly. Setting up table groups, assigning line leaders based on who's sitting where that day, designating morning helpers for different days of the week. All these things can subtly activate this in-group favoritism. Children might start to prefer those in their own arbitrary group. It can impact how they share materials, how they cooperate during group tasks, or even just who they instinctively choose to play with during recess across those different groups. It's often not about active dislike or hatred for the outgroup. It's more about a strong, almost unconscious bias towards those who are momentarily like us, those who share our temporary group label. Understanding this allows an educator to be much more intentional about how they form groups and manage the interactions between them.
That's a truly powerful insight. It really makes you pause and think twice about how you structure even the simplest classroom activities, doesn't it? Recognizing those underlying social dynamics that are always at play. So, okay, if the minimal group study showed this deep drive for in-group favoritism, is it mainly about wanting your group to be distinct? Or is there a strong link to boosting personal self-esteem? I remember the source material discussed the self-esteem hypothesis.
That's an excellent question, and it really speaks to the evolution of the theory itself. Initially, yes, a popular idea that emerged from early interpretations of SIT was indeed the self-esteem hypothesis,
Which suggested.
that we engage in this in-group favoritism primarily to enhance our personal self-esteem. The thinking was, by making our group look good, we individually feel better about ourselves. It makes intuitive sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
However, as the theory matured, particularly through Tajfel and John Turner's continued rigorous work, the emphasis shifted quite significantly. While personal self-esteem can certainly be a pleasant byproduct of having a positive group identity, they argued that the deeper, more fundamental drive is actually for positive group distinctiveness.
So distinctiveness is primary.
They argued it was more fundamental. It's the intrinsic need for our group to be meaningful, unique, and clearly defined in relation to others. It's about establishing a valued collective identity, which isn't solely reducible to an individual's personal feelings of self-worth.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about a school's debate team. They strive to win their competitions, not just so each individual member feels smart, but to solidify the team's collective identity as the champions, or the most articulate, against rival schools. That distinctiveness, that comparison, is key.
Okay, that clarifies it.
And building on this idea of distinctiveness, another psychologist, Marilyn Brewer, developed her optimal distinctiveness theory. It offers a really intriguing perspective. She suggested that group identity actually satisfies two competing fundamental human needs: the need for social inclusion, to belong, and the need for social differentiation, to be unique and distinct.
So we want to fit in, but also stand out.
Kind of, yes. Those two needs pull in opposite directions. Interestingly, she argued that small minority groups might actually optimally satisfy these competing motives because they offer a strong sense of belonging within a unique, clearly distinct group. You get both inclusion and differentiation.
How does that differ from SIT's distinctiveness?
SIT's core concept of distinctiveness is primarily about differentiating one's group, whatever its size, from relevant comparison groups in a specific social context. It isn't necessarily linked to the relative size of the group in the way ODT emphasizes. It's more about the comparison process itself.
Got it. That distinction is important. It clarifies that it's not just about an individual feeling good, but about the group defining itself in a meaningful way against others. But what happens when a group isn't seen as distinct in a positive way? The source material really highlights that not all group memberships automatically give you a positive identity, especially for groups that are disadvantaged or hold a lower status in society.
This is a truly critical aspect of social identity theory, and one where it really shows its depth. SIT is often considered a normative theory within social and political science.
What does normative mean in this context?
It means it doesn't just describe how groups behave neutrally. It actively identifies with the struggles and perspectives of disadvantaged groups. It seeks to understand their motivations, their strategies, and the potential pathways they might take to improve their social position and achieve greater equality.
So it's interested in social change.
Very much so. It provides a framework for understanding both social change and social stability. It asks, how do these groups cope when faced with a negative or devalued social identity that's often imposed by others? And what active strategies might they employ to overcome that, to challenge it?
Okay, let's dive into those specific strategies. The source outlines a few key ways disadvantaged groups might respond, starting with something called individual mobility.
Right. Individual mobility is essentially an individualistic strategy. It's where members of a disadvantaged group attempt to leave their group and move to or gain acceptance into a higher status group. Like trying to pass. Sometimes, yes, or just striving for individual advancement out of the low status situation. The key thing here is that this strategy doesn't fundamentally challenge or change the overall status quo of the intergroup relations. It's about personal escape or advancement, rather than trying to uplift the entire group.
Can you give a classroom example?
Sure. For an elementary school student, this might look like a child who is part of a less popular playgroup trying very, very hard to gain acceptance and join a different, more popular clique on the playground. They're trying to move up the social ladder individually.
Or maybe academically.
Yes, or it could be a student who feels academically behind and strives intensely to join the advanced readers group, not necessarily with the goal of helping their original group improve, but to personally move into what they perceive as a more esteemed category. It's about navigating the existing hierarchy, not trying to dismantle it.
Okay, so individual mobility doesn't actually change the dynamic for the group they left behind. What about something that addresses the collective situation more directly? Something more group-oriented?
That's precisely where social competition comes into play. This is a far more collective strategy, and it involves a direct challenge to the dominance or superiority of the higher status group.
Okay, so this is more confrontational.
It often is, yes.
Oh.
For this strategy to be adopted, SIT posits that the disadvantaged group needs to perceive what are called cognitive alternatives to the status quo.
Cognitive alternatives, meaning?
Meaning they have to collectively believe that change is not only desirable, but also genuinely possible. And, crucially, they must perceive the current status relations, the hierarchy, as illegitimate, unfair, and unstable. They have to believe they deserve better and that they can actually achieve it together.
So what might that look like in a school setting?
In a classroom, this could manifest as a class that perceives itself as maybe less valued or less academically successful, in another class actively trying to beat that higher status class in a school-wide competition like a science fair, a sports day, or a fundraising challenge.
A direct contest.
Exactly. Or it could involve children collectively and actively protesting a perceived unfair rule or a decision from a teacher or the school administration that they feel disproportionately affects their group or is unjust. This is a group-level strategy aimed squarely at altering the hierarchy or challenging the perceived injustice.
And if direct competition isn't really a viable option, or maybe if the status quo just seems too deeply entrenched, too hard to challenge head-on, what's the alternative when a group feels they can't physically move out or directly confront the dominant group?
Well, that's where social creativity offers a highly adaptive and often quite ingenious path. This strategy involves disadvantaged groups actively reframing or redefining their negative social identity in a more positive light, often without directly challenging the existing power structure or the status hierarchy.
So it's more about changing the meaning of their identity.
Exactly. It's about psychological restructuring. And disadvantaged groups can achieve this social creativity in several nuanced ways. Firstly, they might choose a more favorable comparison dimension.
How does that work?
Well, for example, if a class consistently struggles with standardized math tests compared to another class, they might consciously or unconsciously shift their focus and proudly declare, okay, we might not be the highest scoring math class, but we are definitely the most creative class when it comes to our art projects. They find a different dimension where they can excel and feel distinctively positive.
Okay, change the playing field. What else?
Secondly, they could choose a different comparison group altogether. Perhaps comparing themselves not to the high-status group, but to a younger or less experienced group, or maybe even comparing their current performance favorably to their own past performance.
Right, finding a comparison that makes them look better.
Yes. And thirdly, and perhaps most profoundly, they can actively work to redefine the negative stigma itself, transforming it into a source of pride and positive identity.
Like reclaiming a negative label.
Precisely. The classic historical example often cited from the source material is the powerful "Black is Beautiful" slogan adopted by African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement. It took a descriptor previously used by the dominant group to devalue and marginalize, and defiantly reframed it as a source of immense pride, beauty, and collective identity.
That's incredibly powerful.
It really is. For a struggling elementary class, maybe one that consistently performs lower on academic tests, they might redefine their collective identity by focusing intensely on their amazing kindness during cooperative projects, or their unbeatable teamwork during group challenges, or maybe their exceptional creativity and imaginative play. This redefinition can build profound collective esteem and solidarity, providing a robust positive identity even when they're facing external challenges or negative comparisons on other dimensions.
Or even for an individual student.
Absolutely. Perhaps a student who consistently struggles with reading speed might, with encouragement from a teacher or peers, redefine themselves not as just a slow reader, but as a really thoughtful storyteller who takes the necessary time to craft rich and detailed narratives. It's about finding and emphasizing the positive aspects within their experience.
That's incredibly powerful. It truly demonstrates how groups aren't just passive recipients of whatever identity society throws at them. They are highly active, adaptive shapers of their own identity, particularly when they're confronting adversity or a devalued status. This nuanced understanding brings us neatly to the next layer of the social identity approach. Self-categorization theory, or SCT. This takes this whole idea of the self and our fluid identities to an even deeper, more fundamental level, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. Self-categorization theory, which was primarily developed by John Turner, who was a key collaborator with Tocqueville, builds directly on the foundations of SIT. But you're right, it represents a much more general and ambitious theory. It's really a theory of the self itself, how the self operates psychologically.
More general than SIT. How so?
Well, while SIT primarily focused on how group identity drives intergroup processes that core us versus them dynamic, SCT expands this framework to explain both intergroup processes and intragroup processes. That is, what happens within a group as well.
Okay.
So if SIT was mainly about us versus them, you could say SCT is about the fundamental cognitive processes that lead to how we become us in the first place. And crucially, how our deeply ingrained sense of self constantly shifts and adapts based on who we happen to be interacting with and the specific social context we find ourselves in at any given moment.
So it's not just about belonging to a group, but how that belonging fundamentally shapes how we actually see ourselves, the very content of our self-definition.
Precisely. SET makes the distinction between what we call personal identity, seeing yourself as a unique individual, and group identity, seeing yourself as a member of a group, far more explicit and, importantly, dynamic. Our self-definition isn't some static, fixed entity we carry around. It's incredibly fluid and highly context-dependent.
Fluid in what way?
It can operate at various levels of abstraction. We can define ourselves very inclusively as part of broad, superordinate groups like humanity or citizens of this country. Or our self-definition can be highly specific, defining us as unique individuals with distinct personal traits, memories, and feelings, our personal identity.
So we have multiple identities available.
Exactly. We all possess this rich repertoire of potential identities available to us at any given moment. Maybe a psychology student, a woman, a parent, a fan of a particular band. And even our personal selves can vary depending on context. For instance, I might experience myself as a sister in one context, which feels quite different from myself in relation to my professional colleagues in another.
Right.
What's truly fascinating here, and a core tenet of SCT, is that self-definition is always relational and inherently comparative. Even our sense of personal identity, who we are as an individual, is defined in relation to other individuals or groups.
Can you give an example of that, how personal identity is comparative?
Sure. Identifying yourself as, say, politically left-wing defines you within a broader political group context, certainly. But it also defines you as an individual in comparison to, perhaps, your sibling who identifies as right-wing. Or describing yourself as shy only makes sense in comparison to other people who you perceive as less shy. Our sense of self is constantly being negotiated and defined within a social field. It doesn't exist in a vacuum.
This concept of fluidity and these contextual shifts in identity seem incredibly relevant for any teacher observing kids. Think about a child on the playground. They might see themselves primarily as the fastest runner or the best at drawing. That's a personal identity, right? Focused on their individual traits.
Yes, likely so in that context.
But then during a school sports day, maybe they put on their team jersey and suddenly they might powerfully become a member of the winning Eagles team. They shift to a salient group identity.
A very clear shift.
And then maybe later, when they're representing the whole school at some district-wide event, they become a student at Lincoln Elementary, activating an even broader superordinate group identity, differentiating them from kids from other schools. These identities aren't fixed. They just shift and become more or less prominent depending on the specific social context and the comparisons being made right then.
That's a perfect illustration. Understanding this allows a teacher to anticipate how a child's behavior, their priorities, their loyalties, even their motivations might change across these different settings within the school day and the school year.
So if identities shift like that, what determines which identity comes to the fore? What makes one identity salient, as you called it, in a particular moment?
Right, that's the key question SET addresses. The salience of a particular identity, whether it's a personal one or a group one, is determined, according to the theory, by an interaction between two key factors: perceptual readiness and fit.
Okay, readiness and fit, what do those mean?
Perceptual readiness is basically about how accessible or easily activated a particular category is in our minds. Think of it like how easily it comes to mind. This is influenced by our past experiences, how often we've used that category, our current motivations and goals, and also how recently we've used that category. Some identities are just chronically more accessible for us than others.
Okay, so how ready we are to see the world through that lens. What about fit?
Fit is about how well a particular category actually maps onto or explains the social reality we're currently experiencing in a given situation. It's about how useful and explanatory that category is for making sense of the people and interactions around us right now. Does this way of grouping people make sense of the differences and similarities I'm observing?
And if I remember correctly from the source, there are two distinct types of fit, right? This is where it gets a little bit more technical, maybe?
Yes, exactly. The theory distinguishes between two types. First, there's comparative fit. This type of fit is maximized when the perceived differences between two potential groups are significantly larger and more pronounced than the perceived differences within each of those groups.
So the groups look very different from each other, but people within each group look relatively similar.
Precisely. Imagine you're looking at two clusters of students in a classroom. A potential categorization, say boys versus girls, becomes most fit in a comparative sense if, on whatever dimension is relevant at that moment, maybe preferred play activities, the average difference between the boys and girls seems clearly greater than the average differences amongst the individual boys or amongst the individual girls.
Okay.
It's essentially our cognitive system automatically looking for the most efficient way to carve up the social scene, the way that highlights the clearest, most meaningful boundaries between potential categories. And this comparative fit is actually quantifiable using what SET calls the meta-contrast principle.
Meta-contrast.
Yeah, it basically calculates the ratio of the average perceived between category differences to the average perceived within category differences. The greater this ratio, the stronger the comparative fit, and the more likely that particular categorization will become salient and guide our perceptions and behavior.
Okay, that's comparative fit. What's the second type?
The second type is normative fit. This isn't primarily about the magnitude of numerical differences, but about the meaning or the typical characteristics we associate with social categories. It's about whether the observed differences between groups align with the content or the norm associated with those categories, often based on shared cultural knowledge or stereotypes.
So it's about whether the differences fit our expectations.
Exactly. For instance, let's go back to that example of a discussion between British and Dutch people. If the topic being discussed is, say, the future of the European Union, their national identities might become highly salient because their differing historical perspectives or political attitudes provide strong comparative fit. The between-group difference is large. But if the topic shifts to something like, say, appropriate ways to express emotions in public, then maybe gender might become a more salient categorization. This would be based on normative fit, drawing on commonly held societal stereotypes or norms about how men and women are expected to express feelings differently. The observed behavior fits the expected norm for that category.
That makes perfect sense. So in a diverse elementary classroom, you can really see this interplay. If the conversation among a group of students is just about what snacks we like best, then individual preferences might be most salient. Everyone is just an individual with their own favorite snack. Personal identity rules.
Likely is.
But if the discussion shifts to what our class wants for the school carnival compared to what the other fourth grade class wants, then suddenly their class member identity becomes highly salient. Comparative fit is high our class versus their class. It unifies them toward a shared goal.
Good example.
And then, if a visiting group of students from another school comes for some inter-school event, then the student from our school identity becomes even more salient, clearly differentiating them from the visitors. Both comparative and normative fit might be high there. It really highlights how a teacher can, maybe inadvertently or certainly intentionally, activate different levels of identity simply by structuring activities or framing discussions in particular ways. It feels like a really powerful lever for classroom management and for building a sense of community.
It absolutely is. And this leads us to a really fascinating and often quite misunderstood new perspective on social stereotyping and even the concept of depersonalization that emerges from this framework.
Okay, stereotyping. How does SCT view that differently?
Well, SCT fundamentally suggests that stereotyping isn't just about, automatically accessing some fixed, often negative schema we have stored away about how Group X typically is. Instead, it proposes it's a much more dynamic and adaptive process. It's about constructing appropriate and relevant stereotypes that make sense in a given context.
Constructing them, not just retrieving them.
Yes, constructing or emphasizing certain aspects based on the comparison being made. For instance, the stereotype of, say, psychology students might be creative thinkers when they're being compared to physics students in a discussion about different approaches to problem solving.
Okay.
But that same group of psychology students might be stereotyped, perhaps by themselves and others, as highly analytical or intelligent when they're being compared to, say, art school students in a discussion about academic requirements. The content of the stereotype isn't fixed. It's relational. It's always about the specific comparison being made in that particular context.
So the stereotype isn't just a static label we slap on a group. It's a dynamic relational construct that changes depending on who they're being compared to. Does this also mean that stereotypes aren't always negative? And can they apply to our own in-group as well? That feels quite counterintuitive to how we normally think about stereotypes.
That's a crucial and often surprising point that comes directly from SCT. The theory argues forcefully that stereotyping applies to both outgroups and in-groups. When an intergroup dimension is salient, we attribute stereotypes not just to them, but also to ourselves and our own groups. We see ourselves through the lens of that group identity.
And they're not always bad.
No. Crucially, stereotypes are not seen as intrinsically or necessarily related to prejudice within this theory. In fact, SCT posits that stereotyping is, at its core, a functional adaptive cognitive process. It's designed to help us make sense of and navigate group-level social reality.
A tool for understanding groups.
In a way, yes. Now, that tool can further be used strategically to justify prejudice or discrimination. People can select or emphasize negative stereotypes to rationalize unequal treatment. But, importantly, it can also be powerfully used by disadvantaged groups themselves to contest unfair relations. For example, a group might intentionally embrace a stereotype that's been applied to them, but defiantly reframe it in a positive way as a source of pride and distinctiveness. Think back to that Black is Beautiful example again. It's a tool that can be wielded for different purposes, for oppression or for liberation.
Okay. And this relates to depersonalization. How does that fit in?
Right. Depersonalization is a key concept here. When an intergroup dimension becomes highly salient, when us versus them is the main way people are seeing the world in that moment, SCT proposes that people tend to see themselves and others not primarily as unique, idiosyncratic individuals, but as depersonalized, meaning they see themselves and others essentially as interchangeable representatives of the salient social category. Your individual quirks and differences fade into the background, and what becomes primary is your shared identity as a member of Group A, interacting with members of Group B.
So a person doesn't completely lose their individual identity. It doesn't just vanish, but rather, in that specific context, their actions and perceptions are primarily guided by their group identity, by the norms, goals of that group.
Exactly. You haven't forgotten who you are as an individual, but that personal identity is just less relevant, less influential on your behavior in that particular intergroup moment.
Yeah.
Think about the classic example often used, miners confronting police during a major strike.
Okay.
In that highly charged intergroup context, the miners fundamentally saw themselves primarily as miners fighting for our jobs in our community.
Yeah.
And they perceived the police officers not as unique individuals named Bill or Sarah with hobbies and families, but as functional representatives of their group, the authorities, the opposition.
I see.
This depersonalization helps explain how individuals can sometimes act in ways that might seem extreme or out of character from their usual individual behavior. because their actions are no longer primarily governed by their personal identity, but by the perceived norms, goals, and emotions associated with their salient group identity in that confrontation.
How might this look in a classroom? Is it always negative?
Oh, not at all. Depersonalization can be very positive and functional. In a classroom, during a large school assembly, students might predominantly feel and act like the fourth graders, cheering together, feeling collective pride, rather than just a collection of individual children. Their shared grade identity is salient.
Okay.
When performing a school play, students might feel depersonalized into their roles within the cast group, working together seamlessly, each playing their part for the collective performance. Their identity as cast member overrides individual concerns in that moment. And when an entire grade level is being publicly praised by the principal for excellent behavior, the individual students within that grade often feel a powerful collective sense of pride. They act as proud representatives of that good group, embodying its positive norms and expectations. It's a powerful and often very positive force for cohesion and collective action.
That's a truly powerful idea, that acting as a group can mean temporarily backgrounding some of your individual uniqueness, but in a way that's functional, adaptive, and often quite positive, not necessarily the negative loss of self that older theories suggested. This leads us directly into how these theories apply to real-world group dynamics in action. Things like social influence within a group, how leaders emerge, and even that often misunderstood phenomenon of crowd behavior.
Exactly. Let's start with social influence within groups. Self-categorization theory principles offer some profound insights into phenomena like group polarization. This is the well-documented tendency for a group's collective viewpoint to become more extreme after a discussion, even if the individual members started out with more moderate positions.
Right, like think about a class discussion on a new school rule, maybe a proposed rule about using phones during lunch break. If the average opinion starts off as moderately against it after they all talk it through, they might end up strongly against it, maybe even more strongly than any single individual felt at the beginning.
Precisely. For decades, traditional social psychology kind of struggled to adequately explain why groups tended to become more extreme in their views, when classical conformity theories generally suggested that people should converge around some kind of statistical average or mean position.
So what's the SCT explanation?
The key insight from SET is that social influence isn't just about individuals converging toward the average opinion within their group. It involves both intergroup and intergroup comparison processes. Even if no explicit outgroup is physically present in the room during the discussion, there's often an implied outgroup, the people who hold the opposing viewpoint, or maybe just represent a contrasting norm or attitude.
Okay, so even if they're not there, the group defines itself against them.
In a way, yes. The group then shifts its collective position not just towards the average, but towards what SCT calls a prototypical stance. This is the position that best defines the in-group and maximally differentiates them from that salient or implied out-group. It accentuates what makes us distinct from them.
So it exaggerates the group's initial leaning.
Often, yes, it pushes it further in the direction that makes the group distinct. And importantly, this isn't seen as sheep-like mindless compliance. Rather, SCT frames it as referent informational influence.
Referent informational influence, what does that mean?
It means it's a willing internal process. Individuals first categorize themselves as members of the group. Then they actively learn or infer what the group's norms, attitudes, and defining attributes are, what it means to be a member of this group. And finally, they apply those self-defining characteristics to themselves. It's an active process of social validation and identity-driven behavior, not just passive conformity. You change your view because that new view is the group's view, and you are the group.
So when a class is collectively deciding on, say, a theme for their end-of-year party, individual opinions might start out varied, but then they might polarize towards a more extreme shared preference than anyone initially held, because that preference comes to define what our class wants.
Perfectly.
And the teacher might observe students learning the class's collective, emerging opinion, and then genuinely adopting it, not because they feel forced, but because they authentically identify with that group's perspective as their own. It's a really powerful, subtle form of influence that shapes collective decisions.
Precisely. And this same framework also provides a highly contextual and adaptive approach to understanding leadership. Instead of searching for some single, universal, ideal leader type with a fixed set of traits that applies across all situations.
Like the old great man theories of leadership.
Exactly. SCT argues that leaders emerge and are effective primarily because they best represent the prototype of the group in that specific situation. There isn't one universal good leader profile. What makes a leader effective depends entirely on what the group needs right then, what its current goals are, and what values or characteristics are most salient for defining the group in that particular context.
Just thinking back to history, maybe Winston Churchill, with his rallying speeches and that sort of bulldog spirit, was seen as the prototypical wartime leader for the UK during WWII.
A classic example, yes.
But then, after the war, Clement Attlee, a very different kind of leader focused on social welfare and rebuilding the country, was seen by many as more prototypical and effective for the needs of post-war social change.
An excellent illustration of the context dependency of leadership prototypes.
So for a teacher, this means that the student who maybe excels at mediating conflicts, the peacemaker, might emerge as the most effective leader during a playground dispute, bringing calm and consensus because that's what the group needs then.
Right.
But a completely different student, perhaps one who is incredibly organized and detail-oriented, might naturally take the lead when the class needs to plan a fundraiser or manage a complex project. The best leader is fluid. It really depends on the specific context and the group's current needs and goals.
It's all about effective representation of the group's identity and its most salient aspects in that particular moment. And this contextual understanding extends profoundly to understanding crowd behavior, challenging many of those traditional, often quite negative views of crowds.
Right, the mindless mob idea.
Exactly. Older theories, like Gustave Le Bon's famous concept of de-individuation, often portrayed crowds as these mindless, irrational entities where individuals somehow lost their personal identity, their capacity for reason, leading inevitably to chaos and uninhibited aggression. But this raises an important question, doesn't it? Why do crowds often act so uniformly, sometimes even violently, frequently, without a clear, explicit leader directing everything? Traditional views often pathologize this, painting a picture of contagious loss of individual reason. But the social identity approach, particularly SCT, offers a far more nuanced, insightful, and frankly, more empowering explanation.
Okay, so what is the SCT view of crowds? How does it reframe that classic image of the mindless mob?
Well, SCT argues fundamentally that instead of individuals losing their identity in a crowd, there's actually a profound switch to a social identity.
A switch, not a loss.
Exactly. Crowds, from this perspective, are not just random collections of individuals milling about. They are groups, albeit often temporary or spontaneously formed ones, but groups nonetheless, united by a shared identity relevant to the situation. And the uniform behavior we often see within a crowd comes directly from this process of depersonalization, seeing oneself and others as representatives of the group, and the resulting shared social identification.
And anonymity plays a role here.
Yes, but in the opposite way to what older theory suggested. Interestingly, anonymity within the crowd not being individually identifiable rather than fostering a loss of identity and restraint can actually enhance this depersonalization. It reduces the focus on individual differences between people in the crowd and makes the shared group identity even more salient and influential. This leads to greater conformity to the group's specific norms, not less control.
So anonymity strengthens the group identity.
It can, yes, by making the shared identity the primary focus. This shared social identity is the absolute key. It's what distinguishes a true psychological crowd, a collection of people with a shared identity and common goals, like protesters at a rally. From mere physical crowding, just a lot of people incidentally gathered in one place, like commuters packed onto a subway train. This shared identity provides the crucial norms for behavior, the shared understanding of what's appropriate or expected, even without an explicit leader shouting orders.
So it's not just arbitrary, chaotic behavior that erupts. It's actually guided by the group's shared understanding of itself, its identity.
Precisely. The behavior isn't random or arbitrary at all, according to this view. Crowd members are highly adept at inferring the appropriate group norms for behavior that emerges within the crowd in that specific context. This is an inductive aspect of stereotyping happening at the group level, figuring out how we act. But crucially, this inductive process, figuring things out on the fly, is always guided and constrained by the overall pre-existing group identity that's the deductive aspect. Behavior has to be seen as prototypical of the group's identity to be widely adopted.
Can you give an example of that constraint?
Sure. Think about a large peace rally, a crowd united by an identity focused on nonviolence and protesting against conflict. Such a crowd is highly unlikely to suddenly erupt into widespread violence, even if a few provocateurs try to stir things up. Why? because violent behavior simply isn't prototypical of a peace-seeking group identity. It doesn't fit.
Right, it would violate their shared understanding of who they are.
Exactly. And research on real-world events supports this. Stephen Reicher's famous study of the St. Paul's riot in Bristol, UK, for example, showed that the violence that did occur wasn't indiscriminate chaos. It was highly constrained and meaningful within the context of that community's identity and grievances. It was specifically targeted at symbols perceived as representing exploitation or outside authority, not randomly lashing out at individuals or unrelated property.
So, bringing it back to a school setting. Think about those high-energy school spirit events like pep rallies before a big game, or maybe large-scale charity walks involving the whole school. The students act uniformly cheering, chanting, wearing school colors, not because they've lost their minds or their individual selves, but because they've profoundly embraced their shared school identity in that moment.
Perfect example.
Their actions are guided by the shared norms of school spirit, of supporting their teams or their cause. Even if there's a small group of students who might normally be disruptive in class, the power of the larger shared identity of school pride in that context often keeps their behavior within accepted positive bounds. It's a powerful testament to the self-regulating nature of a shared identity.
Absolutely. It shows the constructive power of shared identity.
That's a completely different and, frankly, far more insightful way to look at collective behavior. It's about shared purpose and identity driving action, not mindless chaos losing control. Okay, let's move into some more advanced insights and powerful extensions that have built on this social identity approach. Let's start with how it helps us understand intragroup dynamics, what happens within a group, and something really fascinating called the black sheep effect.
Right. Because SCT, self-categorization theory, really expanded the social identity approach beyond just focusing on intergroup relations to include the intricacies of intergroup processes. It truly opened up vast new avenues for research and understanding. The black sheep effect is a particularly fascinating example that seems quite counterintuitive at first glance.
Why counterintuitive?
Well, we know from the basic principles of SIT that people generally tend to favor their in-group members, evaluate them positively, and want to enhance their in-group's overall image. That's in-group favoritism. However, researchers like Jose Marquez and his colleagues discovered a surprising nuance to this, which they found that when in-group members are disliked, or when their behavior reflects poorly on the group when they deviate from important group norms in a negative way, they are actually judged more harshly by their fellow in-group members than equivalent out-group members who engage in the exact same negative behavior.
Wait, you judge your own members more harshly for messing up than you judge outsiders? That does seem odd.
It does seem odd initially, doesn't it? But what's fascinating here is that this isn't actually seen as a contradiction of in-group favoritism. It's arguably another more subtle manifestation of it.
How so?
Well, the thinking is that by fiercely rejecting or punishing these deviant black sheep within the group is actively protecting its collective image. It's policing its own internal boundaries and norms, and by doing so, it's maintaining the positive distinctiveness and integrity it strives for. Getting rid of the bad apples keeps the barrel looking good.
Ah, okay. So it's like quality control for the group's identity.
You could put it that way, yes.
Yeah.
For an elementary education major, this has very practical potential applications or observations in the classroom. Imagine a student who consistently breaks a key classroom rule that the rest of the class takes immense pride in following, perhaps being deliberately disruptive during quiet reading time, when the class collectively prides itself on being good readers or maintaining a calm and focused learning environment.
Okay.
Their classmates might actually judge that disruptive student far more harshly, be more annoyed with them than they would a student from a different class who happened to come in and engage in the exact same disruptive behavior.
Why?
Because the in-group member's behavior threatens their class's identity. They are, perhaps unconsciously, protecting their own class's identity as a well-behaved, respectful, and effective learning group by strongly disapproving of the norm violator within their ranks. It's a subtle but powerful social policing mechanism, an internal pressure to conform to the group's valued norms.
That's a really insightful point about how groups actively maintain their norms and protect their identity from within. Okay, another incredibly fascinating and very modern extension of these ideas is the SIDE model. What does SIDE stand for again?
SIDE stands for the Social Identity Model of De-Individuation Effects. It's a bit of a mouthful.
It is. What does it help explain?
The side model was specifically developed by researchers like Martin Lee and Russell Spears to understand how strong, unified group effects could emerge even in groups that were often quite momentary or dispersed. Think about crowds again, but also, crucially, the kinds of interactions happening in early computer-mediated communication or CMC online forums, chat rooms, email lists.
Ah, so relevant for the digital age. How does it work?
Well, it directly challenges that classical de-individuation theory we talked about, which suggested anonymity led to a loss of self-awareness and uninhibited, often antisocial behavior. Side proposes something quite different, focusing on what it calls the cognitive effect of anonymity.
Okay, the cognitive effect.
Side argues that anonymity, whether it's the visual and physical anonymity you might feel in a large crowd, or the online anonymity in a forum where no one knows who you really are, can actually enhance depersonalization.
Enhance it, not reduce control.
Enhance it. By reducing the focus on the individual differences between people, anonymity makes the shared group identity even more salient and psychologically influential. And this, counterintuitively perhaps, leads to greater conformity to whatever the specific norms of that salient group identity are.
So anonymity can make people more group-like.
Exactly, more attuned to and influenced by the group's norms, whether those norms are positive or negative. A seminal study that really demonstrated this involves psychology students communicating anonymously via computer terminals, each in separate rooms. When their shared identity as psychology students was made salient, example, by reminding them of their shared field, these anonymous students conformed significantly more to a polarized group norm that emerged in their discussion compared to students who were visible to each other or compared to situations where their individual identity was made salient instead.
Wow. This is huge for educators, isn't it? Especially with the massive rise of online learning and blended classrooms. It means that even if your students are physically in separate rooms, interacting anonymously on a discussion board or in a class chat, their group identity as the students in this specific online classes can still be incredibly powerful. It can influence their opinions, their contributions, their willingness to agree or disagree, often even more so than if they were sitting face to face.
Indeed. It powerfully illustrates the pervasive nature and the deep psychological reach of group identity. We can be profoundly psychologically part of a group and influenced by its norms, even when we are physically removed from other members and visually anonymous to them.
That explains a lot about online communities.
It does. Think about other examples, too, like homegrown terrorists who become deeply radicalized by conflicts happening in distant lands through online interaction, identifying strongly with a group they've never met in person. Or consider a woman feeling a profound and strong sense of identification, maybe anger or empathy, with a victim of discrimination reported in the news whom she has never personally met, simply because they share a salient group membership like gender.
Right.
The Uvalide model also highlights what's called a strategic dimension of anonymity. How we choose to express our identities online or in crowds often depends on our perceived identifiability and our sense of accountability to different audiences who might be watching or listening.
So anonymity isn't just one thing.
No. For example, being anonymous to certain powerful others, like maybe a teacher or an authority figure, can actually empower otherwise powerless in-group members. It can make them feel safer to be more assertive or to express their true group normative opinions more freely. Think about online student forums, where students might feel much safer challenging a teacher's statement or expressing a collective grievance anonymously than they ever would raising their hand in class face-to-face. The anonymity reduces their personal risk and allows the group identity and its associated views to be expressed more boldly.
That makes a lot of sense. So identity isn't just about passively being something. It's also about actively becoming something through action, through interaction. And those actions can, in turn, reinforce or even change the identity itself. That sounds like it leads us towards the elaborated social identity model, or ESIM.
It's exactly right. ESIM, developed primarily by researchers like Steve Reicher, John Drury, and others, proposes a really dynamic, almost cyclical view of the relationship between identity and action. It suggests that collective action doesn't just depend on having a pre-existing shared social identity. It argues that the very act of participating in collective action can also profoundly transform and strengthen that group identity through the experience, through the practice itself.
So identity enables action, but action also shapes identity.
Precisely. Identity is seen as both a source of collective action, providing the necessary motivation, shared purpose, and understanding, and also a crucial resource for action, giving individuals the courage, direction, and mutual support they need. But crucially, identity also emerges from action. Through shared experiences, particularly experiences of collective struggle or success, the group's identity deepens, solidifies, and sometimes even fundamentally changes.
What are the key processes involved in that?
ESIM highlights three key interconnected themes that drive this dynamic process. First is the feeling of empowerment. When individuals act together, co-acting with others towards a shared goal, they often gain a profound sense of mutual support, collective strength, and efficacy. This experience bolsters their shared identity and makes them feel more capable as a group. The researchers call this collective self-realization, realizing the group's potential through action.
Okay, feeling stronger together. What's the second theme?
The second theme relates to how outgroup authorities' treatment can be a powerful catalyst in shaping identity during collective action. How powerful outgroups, perhaps the police during a protest, or school administration dealing with student activism, or even a rival company in a market struggle address or treat the in-group, can inadvertently galvanize, unify, and sometimes even radicalize the in-group's identity.
How does that work?
This connects to a concept from the philosopher Althusser called interpellation. It's the idea that individuals are sort of hailed or called out by ideological systems or by figures of authority. And in responding to that call, even if it's a negative label, they unwittingly adopt or solidify a particular identity. So if police, representing an outgroup authority, uniformly label and treat a diverse group of protesters simply as generic lawbreakers or troublemakers, regardless of their individual intentions or the diversity within the crowd, that very act of hailing them as a single negative entity can inadvertently solidify their shared identity in opposition to that authority. It can unite previously disparate individuals into a single, more cohesive oppositional group.
So the way the other side treats you shapes who we become.
It can be a very powerful force in identity formation during conflict, yes.
Yeah.
And the third theme ESIM highlights is the importance of the physical and sensuous experience of being in the group during collective action.
Physical experience.
Yes. Things like chanting slogans in unison, engaging in shared rituals or ceremonies, wearing symbolic clothing or colors, or performing coordinated actions like marching together. These aren't just symbolic acts. They are powerful, visceral experiences that reinforce a deep sense of group identity, shared emotion, and oneness. They make the group feel real and tangible.
So let's tie this ESIM model back to the classroom again. It seems like a perfect place to see this dynamic between action and identity play out. A class working together on a really large, challenging, maybe slightly daunting project, like, say, building a community garden from scratch for the school, or organizing and staging an entire school play.
Right, a big collaborative effort.
They aren't just drawing on their existing class identity as the fourth graders to succeed. The very act of struggling together, collaborating intensely, solving unexpected problems, and ultimately succeeding together through that shared, demanding experience, that profoundly strengthens their class identity, doesn't it? It makes them feel more unified, more empowered, more like a cohesive us than they were before.
Absolutely. That's a perfect example of collective self-realization through shared action transforming identity.
And conversely, thinking about that outgroup treatment idea. If, say, the principal's approach to dealing with a class-wide problem, maybe a widespread cheating issue or a collective disciplinary infraction, makes the students feel unfairly targeted or collectively misunderstood as a group, that might inadvertently unite them against the authority figure, right? It could solidify their shared identity in opposition, maybe leading to collective defiance or resentment because of how they perceive they were treated as a group. The interaction itself shapes their collective identity in that moment.
Precisely. The way authorities or other groups respond can be a powerful forge for group identity, for better or worse.
This profound connection between group interaction, identity, and the emotions involved leads us naturally to one more important extension: intergroup emotions theory, or IET. This seems to really ground the emotional aspects of identity in rich detail.
Yes. IET, developed largely by Diane Mackey, Elliott Smith, and their colleagues, really does put the heart into the social identity approach. It systematically demonstrates how our group-based emotional reactions, the feelings we have as group members toward other groups, are not simply arbitrary or purely personal feelings. Instead, they depend directly on our cognitive appraisals of our in-group's relationship with the relevant outgroup.
Appraisals of the relationship? Like what?
Like appraisals of relative status, are we higher or lower?
Yeah.
Relative power, can they harm us or can we influence them? Legitimacy of the status difference, is it the fair? And stability, can things change? These appraisals shape the specific emotions we feel towards the outgroup.
Okay, so it's not just a generic in-group bias that drives all intergroup behavior. It's more nuanced. There are specific, different emotions tied to specific intergroup dynamics, and these emotions predict distinct behaviors.
Precisely. This theory is incredibly helpful because it helps us understand why different forms of prejudice, whether we're talking about racism, sexism, ageism, classism, or other forms of discrimination, often seem to have distinct emotional signatures and tend to manifest in distinct patterns of behavior.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. According to IET, groups that appraise themselves as having low power relative to a dominant outgroup might predominantly feel emotions like fear or apprehension towards that powerful outgroup. And this fear, in turn, often leads to behavioral tendencies like avoidance, appeasement, or other submissive coping strategies.
Okay, fear leads to avoidance. What about high-power groups?
Conversely, groups that see themselves as having high power might feel emotions like anger or frustration if their goals or entitlements are perceived to be thwarted or challenged by a lower status group. And this anger is often associated with action tendencies aimed at confrontation, asserting dominance, or removing the perceived obstacle.
And status matters too.
Absolutely. High-status groups might feel emotions like contempt or disdain towards low-status groups, particularly if they see the status difference as legitimate and stable. This can lead to behaviors ranging from passive neglect to active discrimination. Or sometimes they might feel more benevolent, but still hierarchy-maintaining, emotions like paternalistic pity or sympathy, leading them to help the lower status group in ways that subtly reinforce the power imbalance, believing they know what's best for them.
Wow. So the specific emotional reaction, fear, anger, contempt, pity, is a crucial predictor of the subsequent action or the specific flavor of discrimination.
Exactly. It helps us understand not just why people might generally enhance their in-group, but why they might specifically derogate, avoid, attack, or perhaps patronizingly help a particular outgroup. It brings a much richer emotional texture to the social identity approach.
And it explains other group emotions too.
Yes. Furthermore, IET has been extended to explain phenomena like collective guilt, where members of a group feel remorse or responsibility for historical wrongs committed by their in-group against another group. Or it can explain collective anger felt on behalf of similar others who are perceived to be mistreated, even if one's own group isn't directly involved, fueling a willingness to engage in collective action out of solidarity.
This seems like it has huge implications for understanding the conflicts, but also the alliances that play out within a complex social environment like a school. Think about different groups or cliques. One group might consistently avoid another simply due to perceived status differences and the associated fear or discomfort that arises from that appraisal.
Plausible, yes.
A popular group might look down on a less popular one with a kind of disdain, maybe making jokes at their expense. Or perhaps they act with that sort of we know what's best for them attitude that subtly masks a power imbalance. A perceptive teacher, using this lens, could start to see how conflicts and alliances aren't just about individual personalities clashing or isolated incidents. They're often deeply rooted in these complex, group-based emotions and the underlying appraisals of status and power.
It provides a deeper layer of analysis, definitely.
And furthermore, thinking about collective emotions. Collective guilt could potentially arise if a class as a whole feels responsible for some past misbehavior, like maybe bullying another student, or perhaps for a perceived collective failing, like letting down the school in some way. And that guilt could potentially motivate them to collectively make amends or strive together for better behavior in the future.
It certainly could. Emotions are powerful motivators at the group level, just as they are at the individual level.
Okay, so to try and recap the core contributions of this incredibly rich social identity approach, we've learned that group identity is a really distinct, deeply emotional, and profoundly influential part of our self-concept. It dynamically shapes both our individual behavior and collective action.
Right. It's not just a cognitive label.
Exactly. It's not just cognitive. It involves deep emotional attachment, a fundamental search for meaning, and powerful motivations for how we act in the social world. We've seen how groups are constantly navigating this desire for positive distinctiveness, how they respond strategically to perceived status differences, and how they hold the potential for both maintaining social stability and driving dramatic social change.
A very dynamic picture.
And crucially, our identities are remarkably fluid. They shift with the context depending on who we're comparing ourselves to, and they can even be transformed and solidified through the very act of participating in collective action together.
That covers the key themes well, I think.
So, what does all of this mean for you, our listener, especially if you are indeed stepping into an elementary classroom armed with this newfound understanding? Well, it means that every single interaction, every group activity you plan, every team you strategically create, or even those cliques that just emerge spontaneously on the playground, every single one is like a mini laboratory of social identity in action.
Constantly unfolding.
Exactly. And understanding these profound dynamics gives you incredible power, the power to shape a more positive, more inclusive, and ultimately a more effective learning environment. You can start to anticipate potential biases that might emerge, even from seemingly innocent or arbitrary groupings. You can intentionally design activities to foster positive group distinctiveness in constructive ways. And you can skillfully guide children in navigating the complex social dynamics of the classroom and building strong, healthy relationships across perceived group boundaries. This knowledge isn't just about observing what happens, it's about empowering you to intervene thoughtfully and shape what happens for the better.
And this raises a really important practical question for every educator listening. How can we intentionally leverage the immense power of group identity for good? Because the social identity approach constantly reminds us that while groups can indeed be sources of bias, competition, and sometimes even conflict, they are also profound sources of strength, deep social support, effective coping mechanisms, resilience, and fundamental well-being.
So, groups are essential, despite the potential downsides.
Absolutely essential. Recognizing and actively fostering positive, inclusive group identities in the classroom, whether we're talking about a short-term reading group, a long-term project team, or the entire class as a cohesive community, can build immense resilience in students, cultivate a powerful sense of belonging, which we know is critical for learning, and drive unparalleled collective achievement. By understanding what makes a group feel distinct and valued, how their identity shifts with context, and how shared experiences shape their deepest sense of us, teachers can intentionally design learning experiences that promote cooperation, mitigate negative biases, and empower students not just as individuals, but as thriving, interconnected members of a supportive collective. The immense power of group identity should never be ignored or underestimated, especially when you are in the privileged, influential position of shaping young minds. So, as you think about your future classroom, or maybe even just your interactions later today, here's a final provocative thought to mull over. How might you intentionally design classroom activities, group projects, or even just the daily routines and rituals specifically to foster positive group identities? Identities that not only benefit the individual groups themselves, making them feel proud and cohesive, but that also contribute to strengthening the overall classroom community and enhancing the well being and sense of belonging for every single student within it.